My neighbor always came asking for sugar when I left, but 10 years later, my son told me what really happened in that house. Good morning, my dear friends. I'm Eleanor Mitchell, 72 years old, and today I'm going to share a story that I've kept in my heart for many years. Before I begin, I'd love if you could give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing that my stories reach so many different places. It was 1961. I was 30 years old and full of dreams. My husband, Theodore, and I had been married for 12 years, and we had a beautiful son, James, who was 6 years old at the time. Oh, my James was such a special child, so talkative. People were always amazed by his vocabulary, so advanced for his age. He told stories, asked questions about everything. He was a curious, intelligent boy. His eyes would light up whenever he learned something new. Back then, I worked as a nurse at the only hospital in town. It wasn't easy. I worked long shifts, sometimes leaving home before sunrise and returning after dark. But I loved my job. Taking care of others was always my calling. After years of saving every carefully counted penny, we finally managed to buy our little house. It was a dream come true, a simple house, but ours. I still remember the smell of fresh paint, the white walls I decorated with such care. James's room had blue airplane wallpaper that he chose himself. How happy he was. We moved out of our rental and into a new neighborhood, in a more remote part of town where houses were still being built. We didn't know anyone there. Some streets weren't even paved yet. I remember during those first days, I would stand by the window looking at the other houses, wondering who our neighbors would be, if there would be children for James to play with. The loneliness in that new place weighed on me a bit. It was on a Sunday afternoon that we met the couple next door. We were in the backyard, Theodore fixing up the garden, me hanging laundry, and James playing with his toy cars. The couple approached the low fence separating our houses and introduced themselves. Gerald and Catherine. They had no children and had been married for 5 years. Gerald worked as an accountant at a large company, and Catherine was a housewife. Catherine was a beautiful woman, the kind that draws attention when she enters a room. She had red hair, always well-styled. She wore strong-colored lipstick and clothes that highlighted her figure, completely different from me, who always wore my hair tied back, no makeup, wearing the same simple dress every day. Gerald was a quiet, serious man, even seeming a bit shy next to his outgoing wife. That same Sunday, they invited us over for coffee. I remember Catherine served such a delicious orange cake that I even asked for the recipe. She was very friendly, asking about our jobs, about James, about how we were adjusting to the neighborhood. Gerald spoke little, just smiling and nodding. They seemed like an ordinary couple, like so many others. In the following days, Catherine started showing up at our house, always with some pretext, asking for a cup of sugar, some yeast, wondering if I had a specific recipe. I thought it was normal, neighbors helping each other, building a friendship. Since I spent so much time away working, I was actually happy that Theodore and James had company during the day. But soon, I began to notice something strange. Catherine would always appear on my work days, never on weekends when I was home. When I mentioned this to Theodore, he shrugged it off. Must be a coincidence, Eleanor. You're always looking for problems where none exist. Back then, women were raised to blindly trust their husbands. Questioning them was disrespectful. So I swallowed my doubts, my insecurities, but something still bothered me. It was like a constant buzzing in the back of my mind that I couldn't silence. I started noticing small changes in Theodore. A different cologne, new shirts I didn't remember buying, taking more care with his appearance. He, who used to complain when I worked night shifts, now seemed to encourage me. "Go on, Eleanor. They need you at the hospital." And there was something more concerning. My James, that talkative boy, was becoming quieter every day. At first I thought it was just fatigue from school. Then I thought it might be some problem with his classmates. But when I tried to talk to him, James would avoid my gaze, stutter, change the subject. As a mother, I felt something was wrong, but I couldn't identify what. One night, returning from the hospital, I found James sitting on the front steps, alone in the dark. It was almost 10 o'clock. I was frightened. "James, what are you doing out here alone at this hour?" He looked at me with those big eyes, now full of a sadness that a 6-year-old boy shouldn't know, and said, "Dad said I couldn't come in until he called me." I felt a chill in my stomach. "And where is your father?" "Inside with Aunt Catherine." At that moment, I should have gone in, confronted them both, but fear paralyzed me. Fear of confirming what I already suspected, fear of destroying our family, fear of what would become of me and my son if my marriage ended. So I just took James inside. I pretended not to notice the smell of her perfume in the living room. I pretended not to see the wine glasses on the kitchen table. I put my son to bed and waited for Theodore to make up some excuse. Catherine came to bring us a pie she made. We ended up talking about the renovation they're planning at their house. I just nodded. I had no energy to fight, to question. In my head, I repeated, "Maybe it's just my imagination. Maybe it's not what I'm thinking." But deep down, I knew. And this doubt was eating me up inside like a slow and relentless acid. The days went by, and I began to notice a pattern. Whenever I had a shift at the hospital, Catherine would show up at our house, always asking to borrow something, always with a smile on her red lips. "Eleanor, do you have some sugar I could borrow? Eleanor, do you have a cup of flour? Eleanor, could I use your phone? Ours is having problems." I, naive, would think, how can one person need so much sugar? Today, looking back, I almost laugh at my innocence, but back then it hurt. It hurt to know that while I was taking care of sick people, saving lives, my husband was at home, betraying my trust with the neighbor next door. The worst part wasn't just the betrayal. It was seeing my son wilting like a little flower without water. James, who had once been such a lively, talkative boy, was becoming more and more withdrawn. At school, his teacher called me in, concerned. "Mrs. Mitchell, James isn't participating in class. He used to answer all the questions. Now he barely opens his mouth. When I ask him to read aloud, he starts to stutter. Has something happened at home?" And what could I say? That I suspected my husband was having an affair with the neighbor, that my son was probably witnessing things a child shouldn't see. I just answered that we were going through a difficult period and that I would pay more attention to him. The last straw came on a day when I left the hospital early. There was an emergency with staff shortages, and I was called to cover the morning shift instead of the afternoon. I didn't notify anyone at home. I thought I'd surprise them, maybe take James for ice cream before picking him up from school. When I arrived on our street, I saw that Theodore's car was parked in front of the house. He should have been at work at that hour. I parked a little further away and walked slowly. As I approached, I noticed that the door to our house was locked. I found that strange because normally Theodore left it unlocked when he was home. I went around to the back, through the small yard I took such pride in tending. The living room curtains were closed, which was also unusual for that time of day. That's when I heard laughter, Catherine's voice and Theodore's coming from our bedroom. My heart felt like it was going to explode in my chest. My hands were shaking so much I could barely hold my purse. But instead of going in, instead of yelling, making a scene, I simply backed away. I went back to the car and drove aimlessly for hours until it was time to pick up James from school. That night, watching my husband eat dinner as if nothing had happened, I felt a rage I had never experienced before. It wasn't an explosive rage. It was something cold, calculating. I decided I wouldn't confront Theodore immediately. I needed a plan. I needed to think about my son, our future. In the weeks that followed, I started working overtime at the hospital, not to stay away from home, but to save money. I hid part of my salary where Theodore couldn't find it. I started studying for a promotion that would allow me to work only during the day with a better salary. I sought information about how divorce worked, something so scandalous and difficult at that time that women were practically excluded from society afterward. And the hardest part, I tried to talk to James, but every time I brought up the subject of home, how he felt, if something was wrong, he would clam up like a shell. Those sad eyes would look at me for a second and then look away. "Everything's fine, Mom. I'm just tired." I knew everything wasn't fine. I felt it as only a mother can feel, but I couldn't break through that barrier James had built around himself. And that broke my heart in a way that no betrayal could break. It was after 3 months living in this situation, in this daily pretense, that I finally found the courage to confront Theodore. I waited for a Saturday when James was at a school friend's house. I prepared breakfast like any other day, and then, looking into the eyes of the man with whom I had shared 12 years of my life, I said, "I know about you and Catherine." His face went pale for a second, but he quickly composed himself. "What are you talking about, Eleanor? What madness is this?" "Don't take me for a fool, Theodore. I saw you two in our bedroom, in our bed." He denied it. He denied it with all his might. He said I was imagining things, that it was my sick jealousy, that I needed help. He even suggested that I see a doctor, that maybe it was all in my head. This was a common tactic at that time, making the woman doubt her own sanity. But I was prepared for this. There's no point in lying. Either you admit it and we talk like adults, or I walk out that door with my son and you never see us again. It was only then that he crumbled. He admitted the affair with Catherine, but tried to minimize it. "It was just a few times, Eleanor. It doesn't mean anything." She offered herself. "I'm a man. You know how it is." That hurt me more than the betrayal itself, as if it were natural, expected, for a man to cheat on his wife, as if I should accept it and move on. "I want a divorce, Theodore." The words came out of my mouth before I even realized I was going to say them, but when I heard them, I knew it was what I really wanted, what I needed. What happened next is a story for our next segment, my dears, because what followed completely changed the course of my life and my son's life, and showed that sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones we can't see. When I uttered those words, "I want a divorce," Theodore's face completely transformed. From a repentant, pleading man, he became a stranger with hard features, almost unrecognizable to me. "You won't take my son," he said with a coldness that chilled me. "If you insist on this divorce madness, I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of mother abandons her home to work, leaving her son in his father's care." In 1961, understand, a divorce wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was a stain on a woman's reputation, something that would follow her for the rest of her life like a shadow. Divorced women were seen as failures, inadequate, even of questionable morals. And when there were children involved, oh, society was merciless. The laws of that time favored men in everything. Child custody almost always went to the father, especially if he could prove the mother was negligent in some way. And in my case, the simple fact that I worked outside the home, that I did night shifts, could already be used against me. Even so, I didn't back down. Something inside me had broken irreparably, and I knew I couldn't continue living in that lie. In the weeks that followed, our house became a silent battleground. Theodore continued to sleep in our bedroom. I moved to the living room couch. We didn't talk beyond what was strictly necessary, always careful that James wouldn't notice, although, as I discovered years later, he noticed much more than we imagined. I sought help from a distant cousin who lived in the state capital. She knew a lawyer who agreed to advise me, even knowing I had few resources. He was the one who explained the harsh reality to me. My chances of keeping custody of James were minimal. The court will look at you and see a nurse who works night shifts, who isn't home to take care of her son. They'll look at your husband and see a hard-working man, respected in the community, with regular hours and a home. But he's cheating, I argued, tears streaming down my face, with the neighbor, in our house. The lawyer sighed with that expression of someone who has seen this movie many times before. Mrs. Mitchell, unfortunately for the judge, this won't make much difference. Male adultery is tolerated by society, seen as almost natural. I left his office devastated, but not defeated. If I couldn't have custody of James, at least I would ensure that I could visit him regularly, that I would have the means to offer a better future for us both. That's when I made the decision that would change the course of my life. I applied for the position of head nurse at a larger hospital in the neighboring town, 30 miles away. The salary was almost double, the hours more regular. If I passed, I would have better conditions to fight for custody of my son in the future. I studied like I had never studied before. Every free minute was dedicated to books, notes, preparation for that exam that could mean our salvation. Meanwhile, the situation at home worsened. Theodore began to go out more, to come home late, sometimes intoxicated. There were nights when I feared for my safety, for what he might do in a moment of anger. The most painful thing, however, was seeing James. My boy, once so vibrant, now seemed a shadow of himself. At school, his stuttering got so bad that he refused to participate in oral classes. At home, he spent hours alone in his room, drawing somber figures that tightened my heart. When I tried to talk to him, hug him, comfort him, it was like hugging a wall. He was there physically, but emotionally absent. One night, I found him crying softly in his room, hugging his pillow to muffle the sound. I sat beside him, stroked his hair. "What is it, my love? You can tell me anything. Mommy will understand." He just shook his head, quickly wiping away his tears. "Nothing, Mom. I'm just tired." That stuttering, those eyes avoiding mine, it all tore me apart inside. I knew something was deeply wrong, but I couldn't reach him. I couldn't break through that invisible barrier he had erected. The results of the exam came out in July 1962. I passed in first place, to my own surprise. When I told Theodore, his reaction was exactly what I expected. Threats. "If you accept this job, if you move away from here, you'll never see your son again. I'll tell the judge you abandoned us, that you chose work over family." For the first time, I wasn't intimidated. "Do what you think is best, Theodore. I will too." The divorce process officially began in August. It was a scandal in the small town. I remember walking down the streets and feeling the stares, hearing the whispers. At church, the pastor even delivered a sermon about the sanctity of matrimony while looking directly at me. I lost friends of many years who suddenly didn't want to be seen in my company, as if divorce were a contagious disease. Catherine and Theodore didn't even try to hide the affair anymore. She would show up at our house openly, sometimes even when I was there, with that triumphant smile on her red lips. Gerald, her husband, seemed to have disappeared. I learned later that he had also filed for divorce and moved to another state. The custody hearing was scheduled for November. In the months leading up to it, I desperately tried to get closer to James, to create memories that could sustain our bond during what I knew would be difficult years ahead. I would take him fishing at the river, for ice cream in the town square, to Sunday matinees at the town cinema. He would smile, participate, but there was always something restrained, something broken in that smile. The night before the hearing, I sat on the edge of his bed. James was already asleep, his little face finally at peace, free from the tensions that accompanied him during the day. I stayed there memorizing every detail, every freckle on his nose, each eyelash, the curve of his still chubby child's cheek. I cried silently, the tears falling onto my hands. "I promise I'll fight for you," I whispered, even knowing he couldn't hear me. "I promise that one day we'll be together again." The hearing was exactly as my lawyer had predicted. The judge, a severe man in his 60s, barely looked at me during the process. Theodore presented himself as the dedicated husband, betrayed by his ambitious wife, who preferred to work rather than take care of the family. He brought witnesses, neighbors, friends from the church, who corroborated his version, saying I was absent, that the boy was often in his father's care while I was at the hospital. When it was my turn to speak, I tried to explain about his affair with Catherine, about how he had changed, about my fear for James's emotional well-being. The judge interrupted me. "Ma'am, marital problems are common in any marriage. What concerns me here is the child's well-being." The sentence came as I expected. Theodore got custody of James. I would have the right to bi-weekly visits, always supervised by a member of his family. Additionally, I would have to pay child support, a reversal of traditional roles that caused even more gossip in town. I left the courthouse, feeling that part of me had died there. The lawyer tried to console me, saying that with time, when I was established in my new job, with regular hours, we could file for a custody review. I had 1 week to say goodbye to James before moving to the neighboring town where I would start my new job. They were days of agony, trying to explain to a 7-year-old boy why his mother was leaving, why he wouldn't be able to see her every day anymore. "But I'll come back to visit you, my love. Twice a month, we'll spend the whole day together. It will be our special day." James didn't cry, didn't protest, just nodded with that resigned expression no child should have. On the last day, when I picked him up from school for a special goodbye snack, his teacher pulled me aside. "Mrs. Mitchell, I know it's none of my business, but James isn't doing well. He has completely stopped participating in class, refuses to read aloud, cries in the bathroom thinking no one is watching. Has something happened at home besides the separation?" I felt my heart contract. "I don't know, teacher. He won't talk to me. I've tried everything, but it's like there's a wall between us." She squeezed my hand understandingly. "Maybe with time. Children sometimes hold things they don't know how to express. He might be blaming himself for the divorce. It's common at this age." I nodded, thanked her, but I knew there was more, much more. Something I would only discover years later. Something that would completely change my understanding of those dark days. The goodbye that Sunday was the hardest thing I'd ever done in my life. I packed James's small suitcase with clothes that would stay with me for our weekend visits. I made his favorite dessert, cornbread with guava paste. I tried to appear excited, talking about how fun it would be when he came to visit me, how we would go to the big city park, to the zoo. When the moment came, I hugged him with all my strength, trying to convey in that embrace All the love I felt, all the pain of separation, all the hope for a better future. I love you more than anything in this world, James. Never, never forget that. He nodded against my shoulder, his little arms tight around my neck, and then, in an almost inaudible whisper, the first words without stuttering in months. I love you too, Mom. I got on the bus without looking back, because I knew if I looked, I wouldn't have the strength to leave. Sitting by the window, watching the landscape pass as I moved away from everything I knew, from my son, from my previous life, I let the tears come. I cried silently throughout the journey, a cry of mourning, of loss, but also of determination, because at that moment I made a promise to myself. This would not be the end. It was just the beginning of a fight. A fight for my dignity, for my son, for our future. A fight that, unbeknownst to me, would last years and have twists I could never have imagined. The town that received me was very different from the small community where I grew up. More modern, busier, with too many people to care about other people's lives. I rented a small apartment near the hospital, a modest place, but clean, where I lovingly prepared a little room for when James would visit me. The new job as head nurse demanded a lot from me, but I embraced each challenge, each responsibility. At work, no one knew about my past, no one judged me. I was just Eleanor, the competent head nurse, respected by doctors and subordinates. That new identity strengthened me, helped me move forward on days when the longing for James seemed to suffocate me. The first bi-weekly visits were tense, uncomfortable. Theodore insisted that his sister Irene be present the entire time, a bitter woman who looked at me as if I were the devil himself. James seemed lost, confused, torn between the joy of seeing me and the fear of displeasing his father. And so a new chapter of my life began. A chapter of waiting, of patience, of small battles and small victories. A chapter that, unbeknownst to me, was preparing me for the revelation that would come a decade later. A truth that would change everything I thought I knew about those dark years. My dears, you can't imagine how difficult it is for me to relive these memories. But at the same time, I feel that sharing this story might help other people going through similar situations. So, let's continue. Let's talk about those years away from my son, and how each bi-weekly visit was both a joy and a torture. I moved to the neighboring town in December 1962. I remember it was a time that should have been festive, with Christmas decorations in the streets, colored lights in store windows. But for me, it was the loneliest Christmas of my life. I spent Christmas Eve alone in my small apartment, looking at the tiny tree I had bought and decorated, thinking of James, at the wrapped presents he would only open during our next meeting. We had arranged that on Christmas Day I could see him for a few hours. I arrived at the old house loaded with gifts, my heart beating fast with the anticipation of hugging my son. When Theodore opened the door, the smile on my face froze. Catherine was there, sitting in my living room, wearing an apron in my kitchen, as if that were her rightful place. And worse, she had placed her hand on my son's shoulder in a gesture of false motherhood that made me want to scream. I swallowed the scream, swallowed the tears, swallowed the anger. It wasn't the time for confrontation, not with James watching, not on Christmas Day. I came in, greeted everyone with forced politeness, and focused only on my boy. He seemed so fragile, still so quiet. When I gave him the presents, his eyes lit up for an instant, but soon the light went out, as if he wouldn't allow himself to show happiness in my presence. Those few hours passed in the blink of an eye. Before I could really talk to James, really know how he was doing, Theodore was already checking his watch, indicating it was time for me to leave. I hugged my son tightly. I promised we would see each other soon. I tried to ignore the tears I saw glistening in his eyes when I said goodbye. I returned to my empty apartment, feeling as if I had been punched in the stomach. It was evident that Theodore and Catherine were living together in the house that was once mine. And my son, my little James, was stuck in the middle of that situation. A silent witness to a story that a child should never experience. The routine of bi-weekly visits was established with difficulty. In the first few months, Theodore constantly invented excuses. James is sick. James has a commitment at school. James went to travel with my sister. I filed a formal complaint through my lawyer, and after a warning from the judge, he stopped with the excuses, but the tension remained. Every time I came to pick up James, it was like entering enemy territory. Catherine made a point of being present, of making me feel like an intruder in the house that was once mine. Theodore, in turn, always had a list of instructions, as if I didn't know how to take care of my own son. He can't eat sweets. Don't let him stay up late. Don't take him to crowded places. But the most painful part was the transformation of my James, that boy who was once so talkative, so full of life, now a quiet, introverted child. The stuttering, which had started as something mild, was now so severe that there were moments when he would simply give up on speaking, pointing to what he wanted or responding with gestures. At school, according to Theodore, in an accusatory tone, James was having difficulties. Teachers suggested specialized help, but Theodore refused. There's nothing wrong with my son. I knew something was deeply wrong, but I felt powerless. During our visits, I tried to create an environment of safety, of affection, where James could open up. I would take him for walks in the park, for ice cream, to movie sessions. I photographed every moment, creating an album that documented our meetings, a treasure I keep to this day. Slowly, very slowly, I began to notice small changes. He still stuttered, still avoided long dialogues, but occasionally, when we were alone, doing something he enjoyed, a glimpse of the old James would emerge, a genuine smile, a curious question, a witty comment. In those moments, my heart would fill with hope. At the hospital, my work as head nurse was demanding but rewarding. I earned the trust of the doctors, the respect of the other nurses. I started teaching at the nursing technical course, which provided me with extra income. Every penny saved went into a special account that I mentally called the James Fund, money that I would one day use to fight for custody of my son, to provide him with a better education, opportunities I didn't have. In 1964, almost 2 years after our separation, I felt it was time to try again for James's custody. He was now 9 years old, an age when his opinion would begin to carry some weight in court. I had a stable job, regular hours, a better financial situation. My apartment was now larger, in a good neighborhood, close to excellent schools. I consulted my lawyer, who prepared the petition. I was confident, anxious, full of hope. On the eve of the hearing, when I picked up James for our weekend together, I decided it was time to talk openly with him about the matter. I sat him at the kitchen table, prepared his favorite hot chocolate, and explained as gently as possible that I was asking the judge if he could come live with me. "Would you like that, Mom?" he asked, his large eyes fixed on mine, an expression I couldn't completely decipher. "More than anything in the world, my love. I miss you every day. We could be together always, not just every 2 weeks." He was silent for a long moment, stirring the spoon in his chocolate. When he spoke, his voice was so low that I had to lean in to hear. "Dad said you don't really want me, that you just want to take me away from him." I felt as if someone had thrown ice water over me. "James, that's not true. I love you more than anything in this world. I never, never wanted to be away from you. Then why did you leave? The question, so simple, so direct, completely disarmed me. How do you explain to a 9-year-old child the complex reasons for a divorce? How to make him understand that sometimes we leave precisely because we love, because we want to protect, because we need to strengthen ourselves to fight? It was the hardest decision of my life, my love. But sometimes adults need to make difficult decisions to build something better for the future. Your father and I weren't happy together anymore, and that was affecting you too. Is it my fault? No, never, never think that, I replied, holding his little hands in mine. None of this is your fault. Your father and I have adult problems that have nothing to do with you. The only thing that never changed, that will never change, is how much we both love you. He nodded, not entirely convinced, and went back to stirring his chocolate. I didn't press further. I knew it would be a slow, delicate process, that I couldn't expect years of confusion and pain to be resolved in a single conversation. The next day, at the hearing, I received another devastating blow. Theodore presented witnesses, neighbors, James's teacher, even a doctor, who testified that the separation had been traumatic for the boy, that he became nervous and anxious before and after my visits, that the speech problem had worsened significantly. Most cruelly, Theodore's lawyer suggested that James's stuttering was a reaction to maternal abandonment, that I was the cause of my son's suffering. And to top it off, Catherine testified, describing herself as a present and stable maternal figure in James's life, insinuating that they now formed a harmonious family. When I left the courthouse that day, after hearing the judge deny my custody request once again, I felt a toxic mixture of anger and despair. Anger at Theodore, at Catherine, at the system that seemed determined to punish me for having refused to live in a lie. Despair, thinking about the years to come, the birthdays, Christmases, important moments I would miss in my son's life. But I didn't give up. I couldn't give up, for James, for myself. In the years that followed, we established a routine. The bi-weekly visits became calmer, less tense. Theodore, perhaps satisfied with having won in court, became less hostile. He started to let James come without Irene's supervision. He allowed him to spend some holidays with me. Small victories that I celebrated in silence. In 1966, Theodore and Catherine officially married. It was a hard blow, but expected. The small town that had judged me so harshly before now had a new scandal to comment on. The man who had been abandoned by his wife was now marrying the neighbor, the one who always came asking for sugar. Even from a distance, I heard the rumors, the malicious comments that reached me through one or another acquaintance who still kept in touch. James was 11 years old then. The stuttering persisted, but had improved a bit. He was still a quiet, introspective child, but with me, he was beginning to open up more. Together we discovered a love for books. It was one of the few activities that didn't require speech and in which he could completely lose himself. I started bringing a new book to each visit, and we would spend hours reading together, discussing the stories, imagining alternative endings. I realized my son had a special talent for writing. What he couldn't express through speaking, he put on paper with an eloquence surprising for his age. I encouraged this gift, giving him beautiful notebooks, books about creative writing. It was our special connection, something that Theodore, with his pragmatism, neither understood nor valued. In 1967, an opportunity arose at the hospital, the chance to take a specialization course in pediatric nursing in the state capital. It was a unique opportunity that could open many professional doors. but it would mean being away for 6 months, drastically reducing my visits to James. The decision was agonizing. On one hand, the course represented an advance in my career, the possibility of an even better salary, more stability. On the other hand, how do you explain to a 12-year-old boy that his mother, who already saw him so little, would now see him even less? I talked to James openly. I explained the situation. To my surprise, he encouraged me to go. "You'll be an even better nurse, Mom," he said with a small smile. "And when you come back, you'll have many stories to tell me." That maturity, that generosity coming from a child who had already suffered so much, moved me deeply. I hugged my son tightly, promising I would write every week, that I would call whenever possible. Long-distance calls were expensive and rare at that time. That the 6 months would pass in the blink of an eye. The months in the capital were intense, full of learning, new experiences. I kept my promise to write weekly to James, long, detailed letters filled with stories, questions about his day-to-day, expressions of love and longing. His responses, though shorter, were precious. I noticed that in writing, without the pressure of speech, his brilliant personality emerged. When I returned in January 1968, James was visibly different. Taller, the childish features beginning to give way to those of a teenager. But there was something more, a change that wasn't just physical. Something in his eyes, a deeper sadness, a shadow that wasn't there before. I tried to talk, to ask how the months at his father's house had been, how school was, his friends. He answered with monosyllables, avoiding my gaze. I attributed that behavior to the difficult preteen phase, to the months of separation, to the natural changes of that age. I didn't insist, didn't pressure, didn't know then that my son was carrying a secret too heavy for his young shoulders. A secret that would only be revealed many years later, on a day that would forever change my understanding of everything that had happened since that distant afternoon when Catherine first came asking for sugar. The following years took their course. James entered adolescence with all the complications of that phase. The relationship with his father, as he told me between the lines, was becoming increasingly tense. Theodore, a traditional man, didn't understand his sensitive son, a lover of books, who preferred the library to the football field. Catherine, in turn, seemed to have lost interest in being a mother. Now that she was officially married to Theodore, that she had the status of a wife, the boy seemed to be more of a nuisance, an uncomfortable reminder of the previous marriage. And so, little by little, James began to spend more time with me. The bi-weekly weekends extended, with Theodore's reluctant permission, to entire weeks during school vacations. Every moment together was precious, a chance to strengthen our bond, to rebuild what had been broken. In 1972, when James was 17 years old, something happened that would again change the course of our lives, something I could not have predicted, but which would be the beginning of a revelation that would only be completed years later. As I told you before, the relationship between James and his father was becoming increasingly tense. My son had become an introspective young man, passionate about literature and philosophy, interests that Theodore considered things for sissies, as I discovered later. The stuttering, though still present, had improved considerably. James spoke more fluently with me, but according to him, it would worsen in his father's presence. During the July vacation that year, James spent 3 entire weeks with me, the longest we had shared since the separation. They were wonderful days. I took him to the theater, to exhibitions, introduced him to colleagues from the hospital who had children his age. He blossomed before my eyes, like a plant that finally receives light after a long time in the shade. On the night before his return to his father's house, we were sitting on the small balcony of my apartment. The starry July sky stretched above us, and we talked about his dreams, his plans for the future. James wanted to study literature, to be a teacher, maybe a writer. "Dad says that's not a man's profession," he commented, the stuttering returning slightly at the mention of Theodore. "He wants me to work at the factory with him." I took a deep breath, containing my irritation. Even after all those years, Theodore continued trying to mold his son in his image, without respecting his individuality. "And what do you want, my son?" He was silent for a moment, looking at his hands. When he raised his face, there was a determination in his eyes that I had never seen before. "I want to live with you, Mom. I can't stand that house anymore." Those words, which I had waited to hear for so many years, caught me by surprise. "Are you sure, James? Your father?" "I don't care what he'll say. I've thought about it a lot. Next year I'll be 18. I want to go to college. I want to study, Mom. I want a life different from what he plans for me." That night we made plans. As I imagined, Theodore wouldn't easily accept his son's decision. We would need to wait a few months, prepare the ground, maybe consult a lawyer to understand the legal implications, since James was still a minor. The next day, I took him back to his father's house with a lighter heart than in any other return. There was hope on the horizon, the prospect of finally having the chance to rebuild our family, to recover the lost years. But fate had other plans. 2 weeks later, I received a call in the middle of the night. It was from the emergency room at the hospital in our old town. Theodore had suffered a serious accident at the factory, a defective machine, a momentary distraction, and he had lost 2 fingers on his right hand. He was in surgery, and James, alone at home with Catherine, was in shock. I took the first morning bus, arriving at the hospital a few hours later. I found James in the waiting room, his face pale, his eyes red from crying. Catherine was nowhere to be found. "Where is your stepmother?" I asked, after hugging him at length. "She went to get coffee," he replied, but his tone seemed strange to me. "She's very nervous." I learned later that Catherine had a nervous breakdown when she saw Theodore bleeding and had to be sedated. It wasn't the first time she had shown fragility in moments of crisis, a stark contrast to the image of a strong, determined woman she projected. Theodore's accident was more serious than it initially appeared. Besides the loss of fingers, there was damage to the tendons and nerves in his arm. He would need months of recovery, physical therapy, and probably would never have the same movement again. This meant he couldn't return to the same role at the factory. That afternoon, sitting next to a sedated Theodore, with James sleeping exhausted in a nearby chair, I saw Catherine enter the room. Our eyes met, and for the first time in all those years, I didn't see triumph or contempt in her eyes. I saw fear. "He won't be able to work for months," she said in a low voice. "How will we support ourselves?" That "we" bothered me. She spoke as if James didn't exist, as if his needs weren't part of the equation. In the days that followed, it became evident that Catherine didn't have the emotional structure to deal with the situation. She would appear at the hospital only for short periods, always nervous, always in a hurry to leave. Most of the time, it was James who stayed with his father. A silent, sad James, who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. I decided to stay in town for a few days. I took leave from the hospital where I worked, rented a room in a nearby boarding house, and took turns with James in caring for Theodore, not for him, who had never shown any compassion for me, but for my son, who, despite everything, still loved his father. It was during these days that James and I had deeper conversations. Walking through the town streets after visiting the hospital, sitting on park benches, he began to tell me more about his life in his father's house. About how Catherine, who initially tried to get close, now barely spoke to him. About the frequent arguments between her and Theodore, which increased when she couldn't get pregnant. She wanted her own child, James told me. She said I didn't count, that I was your son, not hers. Each word was like a knife in my heart. I imagined my boy alone in that house full of tension, witnessing fights, feeling like an intruder, a burden, while I was miles away, powerless to protect him. When Theodore was discharged, a week later, the situation at home became unsustainable. With her husband unable to work, receiving only insufficient disability assistance, Catherine began to show her true character. The arguments became daily, sometimes evolving into verbal abuse that James was forced to witness. It was on one of these nights, when the raised voices prevented him from sleeping, that James made a decision. He packed a suitcase with his clothes, his most precious books, and left the house unnoticed. He walked to the bus station and bought a ticket to the town where I lived, using money he had been saving from small jobs he did. I woke in the early morning to knocking at my apartment door. When I opened it, I found my son, his worn suitcase at his feet, his face determined despite the deep dark circles under his eyes. "I'm not going back, Mom. I can't live in that house anymore." At that moment, I didn't hesitate. Even knowing I could face legal problems, that Theodore could accuse me of kidnapping for harboring a minor without authorization, I opened my arms and my home to my son. "You're home now, my love, and you don't have to go back if you don't want to." In the days that followed, I consulted a lawyer. Since James was about to turn 18, and considering the exceptional circumstances, Theodore's accident, the financial and emotional instability in his home, there was a possibility we could get James's emancipation accelerated. This would allow him to make his own legal decisions, including where to live. To our surprise, Theodore didn't fight against this. Perhaps out of wounded pride, perhaps from being overwhelmed with his own problems, or perhaps, I want to think, for finally recognizing that the best place for his son was beside his mother. He signed the necessary documents, and in September 1972, James officially came to live with me. Those first months were ones of adaptation. He had to transfer schools, make new friends, adjust to a completely different routine. I rearranged my schedules at the hospital to be more present, to make up for the lost years. James's stuttering improved considerably during this period. Away from his father's intimidating presence, he seemed more relaxed, more confident. At the new school, with the encouragement of understanding teachers, he began to participate more in class, to give oral presentations that would have been unthinkable before. In December of that same year, we received surprising news. Catherine had left Theodore. According to rumors that reached us, she had left with a cosmetic salesman who periodically passed through town. She had left only a note, without explanations, without goodbyes. James received the news with a mixture of emotions. On one hand, there was relief. Catherine had never been a positive figure in his life. On the other hand, concern for his father, now alone, still recovering from the accident, without a steady job. "We should visit him at Christmas," James suggested, surprising me. "He doesn't have anyone else now." And so, on Christmas Eve 1972, we returned to the house that was once ours. We found Theodore changed, aged beyond his years. The accident, Catherine's abandonment, his son's departure, all of it seemed to have broken something fundamental inside him. For the first time since I had known him, I saw Theodore cry. Not tears of anger or manipulation, but those of a man genuinely defeated by life. He awkwardly hugged his son with his good arm, and even to me, he directed a look without the usual hostility. That visit was the beginning of a different relationship between the three of us. We weren't a family again. We would never be. But there was a kind of truce, a tacit recognition of past mistakes, an attempt to build something new from the ruins of what had been destroyed. In the following year, 1973, James turned 18 and applied to college for a literature degree, being admitted with distinction. His dream of becoming a teacher, of working with the written word, that same word that for so long had been stuck in his throat, was becoming reality. It was also in 1973 that I met August, a widowed doctor who worked at the same hospital as me. After years dedicated exclusively to work, and James, I allowed myself, at 42, the possibility of a new love. August was kind, patient, respectful, the opposite of Theodore in every way, and most importantly, he treated James with the same kindness and respect with which he treated me. Life, which for so many years had seemed a constant struggle against the current, was finally flowing in our favor. James was in college. I had a job I loved, a new relationship that made me happy. Even Theodore seemed to be finding some peace. With the compensation from the factory, he opened a small bar that allowed him to work despite his disability in his hand. But there was still a ghost from the past haunting us. Something James carried inside himself, a secret that weighed in his eyes when he thought I wasn't looking. Something that would only come to light some years later, on a hot summer night, which would forever change my understanding of everything we had lived through. The truth was coming, though I didn't know it yet. The truth about those distant days, about the meetings between Catherine and Theodore, about what my son had really witnessed while I worked at the hospital, saving lives, not knowing that my own son's life was being irrevocably marked by traumas that no child should bear. It was January 1976. James was 21 years old and in his third year of literature at the university. I had married August the year before in a simple ceremony with James as our best man. Life had found a new rhythm, a new harmony that seemed almost miraculous after so many years of struggle and suffering. That particularly hot summer, we decided to spend a week at the beach, the three of us together. August rented a small house just steps from the sea, a luxury we could never have imagined in the difficult times. The mornings were dedicated to walks on the sand, sea bathing, reading under the beach umbrella. The nights to conversations on the porch, contemplating the stars, listening to the sound of the waves. It was on one of these nights, after August had retired early, leaving me alone with my son, that the past returned like an unexpected wave, washing away the sands of time to reveal what had been buried for so many years. We were sitting side by side in the porch's straw chairs, observing the full moon reflected on the sea. James was quieter than usual, seeming lost in distant thoughts. When I asked if everything was okay, he just nodded, but continued with that distant look that I knew so well, the look that indicated something was deeply troubling him. "Are you sure, son? It seems like something's bothering you." He took a deep breath, his fingers nervously drumming on the arm of the chair. The stuttering, which had almost disappeared for years, returned slightly when he finally spoke. "Mom, I have something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." I felt a chill down my spine, a premonition that what would follow would change everything. "You can tell me anything, my love. Anything." He looked to the horizon, as if seeking strength in the immensity of the ocean. "It's about Dad, about him and Catherine, about what happened when you left for work." My heart raced. I always knew there was something more, something James carried as an invisible weight, but nothing could have prepared me for what he revealed on that starry night. "I knew everything, Mom, from the beginning. I saw when she came, when they pretended it was just to ask for sugar or any other excuse. I saw what they did when they thought I was playing in the backyard. He paused for a moment, catching his breath, his voice firmer when he continued. Once I was hidden in my room. I had come back early from the neighbor's house where I was playing. I heard laughter in the living room, and when I peeked, I saw the two of them together on the couch. Dad noticed my presence and was furious. He pulled me by the arm, took me to the room, and— Here his voice failed. I saw tears beginning to stream down his face, now no longer that of a boy, but of a young man who still carried the scars of a stolen childhood. He made me promise never to tell you. He said that if I told, you would leave and never come back, that it would be my fault for destroying our family. He said no one would believe me, that I was just a stupid boy who couldn't even speak properly. Each word was like a stab in my heart. I imagined my little James, at just 6 years old, carrying that terrible secret, that threat, that constant fear. That's why I started to stutter, Mom. The fear of speaking, of the words escaping without wanting, of destroying everything. It was like a knot in my throat that never untied. The more I tried to hide, the harder it became to speak. At that moment, so many puzzle pieces fit together. The sudden change in James's behavior, the stuttering that arose from nowhere, the way he isolated himself, how he avoided conversations that could lead to the forbidden subject. It all made terrible, painful sense. At school, I stopped participating in classes because I was afraid that if I started talking, I wouldn't be able to stop and the secret would escape. The other boys mocked me because of the stuttering. They called me dummy, and that only made everything worse. Silent tears ran down my face as James continued his revelation. As a mother, the worst feeling is knowing your child suffered and you weren't there to protect him. That while you were fighting to build a better future, he was trapped in a lonely nightmare with no one to trust, no one to comfort him. When the divorce came, it was even worse. I knew the truth. I knew Dad was to blame, that he had betrayed you, but I couldn't say anything. And then, when the judge decided I would stay with him, it was like a punishment for my silence, as if God was punishing me for not having told the truth. James, my love, I managed to say between sobs, none of this was your fault. You were a child, an innocent child caught in the middle of adult problems. You should never, never have been put in that position. But if I had told, maybe you wouldn't have gone away. Maybe we could have stayed together. That phrase broke me into 1,000 pieces. For years, my son had carried not just the weight of the secret, but also the guilt for our separation. A guilt that was never his, that should never have been placed on his small shoulders. Even if you had told, my love, the laws of that time probably would still have favored your father, but it would have given me more strength to fight, to try other alternatives. What's important is that now we're together, that you no longer need to carry this secret. He nodded, wiping away tears. When I went to live with you, after Dad's accident, it was like a huge weight lifted from me. Away from him, away from that house full of bad memories, I could finally breathe. That's when the stuttering started to improve. We were silent for a long time, just feeling the sea breeze, hearing the waves, letting the finally revealed truth find its place between us. It wasn't a beautiful truth. It was painful, terrible, but it was liberating. Why did you decide to tell me now after so many years? I finally asked. He smiled sadly. I'm writing my senior thesis on childhood trauma and speech disorders. During the research, I realized I had never really processed what happened, that part of me was still that frightened boy, carrying a secret too heavy. My son was using his own pain to understand, to help others. That thought brought a mix of pride and sadness so intense that I could barely breathe. My therapist said that telling you would be an important part of the healing process, that I couldn't really move forward without freeing myself from this secret. I didn't know James was in therapy. He had hidden this from me, probably not to worry me, not to reopen old wounds. Once again protecting me when I should be protecting him. Thank you for trusting me now, my son, for sharing this weight with me. That night, embraced on the beach house porch, we cried together. Tears of pain for a past we couldn't change, but also tears of relief, of liberation. The secret, finally revealed, lost its power over us. In the days that followed, we talked more openly about the past. James shared other details, other memories he had repressed for years. We talked about Theodore, about Catherine, about the judicial system that had failed us, about the society that judged working mothers while forgiving unfaithful fathers. August, with his sensitivity and wisdom, gave us space for these conversations, but also offered us support when we needed it. His calm presence, his unconditional acceptance were balms for old wounds that were finally beginning to heal. When we returned from that trip, something had fundamentally changed between James and me. The invisible barrier that still existed, that shadow of the unrevealed past, had dissipated. We were closer, more honest with each other. The mother-son relationship had transformed into something deeper, a partnership based on truth and mutual understanding. A few weeks later, James suggested we visit Theodore. Not for him, Mom, for us, to close this chapter for good. We found an aged man, embittered by the life he had built with his own choices. His small bar barely provided enough for his living, the mutilated hand a constant reminder of his losses. When he saw us enter, his eyes widened in surprise. James got straight to the point, without stuttering, his voice firm and clear. I came to say that I told my mother everything about you and Catherine, about the threats to keep me quiet, about how it affected my life. Theodore's face paled. For a moment, I thought he would deny it, that he would try once again to manipulate the situation, but the years and the losses seemed to have given him some perspective. I'm sorry, son, he said, his voice breaking. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't forgive myself. It wasn't a moment of dramatic reconciliation, of hugs and tears. It was a moment of truth, of acknowledgement, of closure. We left there, not with anger, not with resentment, but with the feeling that a cycle was finally complete. In the years that followed, James graduated with honors, became a university professor specializing in literature and studies on trauma and language. He married, had children, my precious grandchildren who never met the grandfather who hurt their family so much. For Theodore passed away in 1980, alone in his small apartment at the back of the bar. Catherine, we later learned, went through several relationships, always seeking material security, which seemed to be her main motivation in life. The last news we had of her was that she lived in the south of the country, married to a local businessman, apparently having found the stability she so desired. As for me, I built a full life alongside August, James, and later my daughter-in-law and grandchildren. I retired as the nursing director of the hospital, respected by colleagues and patients. A life very different from what I could have imagined on that distant afternoon when I discovered Theodore's betrayal. What did I learn from all this? That the truth, however painful it may be, is always the path to healing. That secrets poison only those who keep them, but everyone around them too. That children see, hear, and feel much more than we imagine, and carry these experiences into adult life. I also learned about forgiveness, not as an absolution for those who hurt us, but as a gift we give to ourselves, freeing us from the weight of resentment and bitterness. Theodore never deserved my forgiveness, but I deserve the peace that came with it. And above all, I learned about the power of love, the love that made me fight for my son even when everything seemed lost, the love that gave James the strength to overcome his traumas, to transform his pain into something positive. The love that in the end was stronger than all the lies, all the betrayals, all the obstacles that life put in our way. Today, at 72, I look back and see not just the pain, but also the journey of overcoming. I see a boy who lost his voice out of fear and a man who recovered it through courage. I see a young woman who had everything taken from her and an older lady who rebuilt her life brick by brick, day by day. If you're going through something similar, if you're carrying a secret too heavy, or if you're separated from someone you love by circumstances that seem insurmountable, I want you to know there is hope. The path may be long, may be painful, but there is light at the end. Truth liberates, love heals, and time, that silent ally, works in our favor when we choose to move forward with courage and dignity. Thank you for listening to my story, for sharing with me these memories that for so long were kept in my heart. If it touched you in some way, if it brought some reflection, some comfort, then it was worth reliving these difficult moments. And remember, never underestimate what a child sees, hears, and feels. Never underestimate the marks that our words and actions can leave on those we love. And never ever give up fighting for love, because in the end, that's all that really matters. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Your comments mean a lot to me. Let me know down below if you've experienced something similar or what you thought of my story. Share it also